Russian aviation is something that Russian propagandists love to boast about. It occupies an important niche in the myth called the Second Army of the World.
The advanced multi-role fighters Su-35S and Su-57 are in the final stage of state trials. These machines have incredibly unique characteristics and are truly the best in the world.
The best, the fastest, the most powerful, and many more like that. The very best is poured into the ears by the Russian authorities. To confirm this, Putin himself tries to sell his planes to the world at a higher price. In 2019, for example, he took leaders of other countries to show off the then brand new Su-57. However, in Russia, they very tactfully remain silent about the fact that Russian aviation is indeed actually in decline, and most of Russia's planes are still from the Soviet era with not much time left. This is confirmed by numerous unforeseen, unexpected, and unanticipated incidents involving the crash of Russian pride. Another one. Russia has always tried to compete with the USA in the arms race. And of course, they constantly shout that the Kremlin is winning in this competition. But there's a catch. The United States has long since stopped competing with Russia. After all, the level of Russian aviation is now what the USA had about 20 years ago.
Diligence is actually a separate talent. It's not just, a rubber butt.
But if the Russians want to compete, it's the perfect time to compare the aviation power of the States and Russia. What can Washington boast about? And does Moscow have anything to respond with? Let's figure it out. To not immediately shatter the wet dreams of the Russians, we'll start with their aviation. For example, the relatively new Su-34s. It was put into service a little over 10 years ago, although its first flight was back in 1990. But today we won't pay attention to such trifles. So, the almost new Su-34. The Su-34 is a modification of the more well-known Su-27. For the first time, Russia used the Su-34 back in 2008 during the invasion of Georgia. They were also deployed in Syria. The fighter had not yet been officially commissioned, but Russian propaganda tried to create the image of an extremely powerful aircraft. However, even in Syria, the fighters failed. It turned out that they were, to put it simply, not very accurate. Therefore, the Russian authorities rebranded and rearmed the aircraft. The new Su aircraft was loaded with cluster munitions instead of precision-guided ones. Nothing changed during the invasion of Ukraine. The Su-34 usually drops bombs, but even then, they occasionally mess up. For example, when they accidentally decided to bomb Belgorod, to understand how old this aircraft is on a global scale, the Su-34 is equivalent to the not the F-16, but the F-15E strike, which was commissioned in the late 80s. There is another modernization of the Su-27, which is the Su-35. Considered a 4+ generation aircraft, the first flight of the serial aircraft was in 1992. However, once again, it did not quickly enter service. In the early 90s, the project was halted and only resumed in 2005. Well, once again, we consider this a new aircraft. Its cost is about $100 million. Tens of years of development have not passed. In vain, the Su-35 is better than the Su-27. Let's not hide it. For example, the avionics of the new Sukhoi are better. But when it comes to the old by American standards F-16, the Su-35 catastrophically loses. Yes, in fact, all Russian aircraft lose to the F-16, except probably the Su-57. But we will discuss it later. By the way, the F-16 is already over 40 years old, but it hasn't lost its position in the world. All Russian aircraft can only envy its arsenal. Additionally, it is relatively inexpensive, costing from $10 to $50 million depending on the modification and year of production. The Su-35, oh, I remind you, costs 100 million. The MiGs, I think it's not even worth talking about. Let's move straight to the newest Russian aircraft, the Su-57 fighter jet, which the Russians are indeed absolutely drooling over. According to Moscow statements, this is supposedly a fifth-generation fighter. Its creation began, as is usually the case in the Russian Federation, with an arms race. Russian developers wanted to compete with the renowned and legendary F-22 Raptor, which, in general terms, is already outdated by U.S. standards. But back then, it was an obsession for them. Therefore, the highly skilled Russians quickly made a model. And in 2004 came to Putin with assurances that in just a few years, this bird would be soaring majestically high up into the vast open sky. However, the first tests began only in 2010, and then on the Su-35 engine, which is simply not capable of supersonic flight in cruising mode, which is a requirement for fighters. Fifth generation. Talking about the characteristics of this aircraft is pointless. Everything is just on paper. No one has really seen its actual performance. By the way, we mentioned that the Su-57 was supposed to compete with the Raptor. However, a few years later, the Russians did another flip in the air as the F-22 had already been taken out of production. This happened in 2011, so at that time, Russia claimed that the Su-57 was actually a response not to the Raptor, but to another fifth-generation fighter, the F-35. So let's indeed analyze the F-35, which the US is extremely proud of, and it's also called the most desirable tactical aircraft in the world.
Currently, all branches of the military, including the Air Force, the Army, which are the ground forces, the Marine Corps, and the Navy, will have a unified type of aircraft, such as the F-35, for example.
The F-35 embodies the functions of 3 aircraft on a single platform. The maximum speed of the fighter is 1906 km/h, and the combat radius is about 1,000 km. It has the latest advanced avionics, a multifunctional radar system that effectively operates against both air and ground targets. And also the helmet.
That is, there is also a helmet-mounted targeting system. What does this mean? The aircraft flies forward? The missile? By turning the pilot's head left or right, it targets all 90 degrees, or even programmatically, it first launches forward, then turns and flies towards the target that is pursuing the F-35 aircraft.
And the helmet also highlights targets in the air and on the ground, such as friendly units and other elements in the environment and so on. Moreover, it monitors the pilot's health and overall well-being. The F-35 is not just a dream and aspiration for any country. They have completely shattered Putin's dreams and aspirations for air superiority and dominance. Their Su-57 doesn't even come close. The F-35 wouldn't even look at it. However, for the Americans, even this aircraft has become outdated. You heard right. By U.S. standards, the F-35 is the past. However, the future foundation of U.S. aviation is considered to be the B-21 Raider. 21 Raider. It is expected to single-handedly ensure the dominance of the American armed forces in the air. However, there's nothing to say about it yet, as everything is kept secret.
But that's not surprising considering for what, or more precisely against whom, the B-21 was developed. The aircraft is not for Europe. To fight in Europe or to fight in Africa, the countries are all small. It is specifically and precisely designed for large countries such as China and Russia. It can fly in, travel long distances, and effectively conduct bombings with both conventional and nuclear weapons.
With your permission, we will not draw any conclusions. Instead, you write how you perhaps understand and perceive the American and Russian aviation power? Who, in your opinion, do you think dominates the skies? Also, don't forget to like this video and be sure to subscribe to our new Arsenal channel so you don't miss all the most interesting content.
We have been requesting this equipment from our allies for 2 years, arguing that it would change the course of the war. The agreements on their deliveries have become the most significant breakthrough in providing military assistance to Ukraine. And just the mention that American fighter jets are ready to be sent to the ranks of the Ukrainian armed forces makes the Russians immediately fabricate fakes about their destruction on Ukrainian territory. So where exactly are the F-16s intended for Ukrainian defenders today? Are our pilots really already carrying out missions on them at the front line? And what did the Russians actually destroy? Claiming the elimination of more than half a dozen aircraft? This is what we'll discuss today in Arsenal. The Russian aircraft downfall, as it has already been dubbed in the media, began last summer, but intensified particularly at the end of 2023. Initially on December 22nd, 3 Su-34 fighters were shot down at once, and a few days later, 2 more aircraft. Russia immediately attributed this success of the Ukrainian defense forces to the American F-16 fighters. After all, on the very day the 3 Su jets were shot down, the press reported that the Netherlands had allegedly transferred 18 F-16 aircraft to Ukraine. In reality, it was stated that the fighters were only being prepared for dispatch.
What does it mean they started the transfer? Well, they just began checking these aircraft and preparing the documentation. There were some inspections during the acceptance of these aircraft, equipment operations, coordination.
But the Kremlin's public channels could not be stopped. According to Russian war correspondents, Putin immediately decided to launch a retaliatory strike. And as is always the case on Russian TV, naturally it was successful. Specifically, it was claimed that more than half a dozen hated American fighters were destroyed.
Therefore, it is no coincidence that the Russian side initiated an information campaign regarding the possible transfer of F-16s to Ukraine and accordingly their deployment directly at the moment of striking the seaport of Feodosia. Moreover, it should be noted that the Russian side, in its blatant disinformation, even reported the destruction of about 6 F-16s at airfields in the southern direction.
However, it later turned out that there were no aircraft. According to some military analysts, the strike was carried out on decoys, which was later even acknowledged by certain Russian telegram channels. Our command once again stated there are no F-16s in Ukraine as of now yet. When they appear, you will know about it.
Our command might simply not confirm the receipt of the aircraft, right? Exactly. But hiding the presence of aircraft in the sky, takeoff, landing, flight, use of weapons, any launches, well, that's impossible because takeoffs are observed. Well, most airfields are near cities, near populated areas, practically all near populated areas. Exactly. And not noticing a new type of aircraft in the sky, you know, even grandmothers would notice that.
So when will Ukrainian grandmothers be able to admire the marvel of foreign aviation technology firsthand? Naturally, the delivery timelines are kept under strict secrecy. However, by all indications, the aircraft should arrive in Ukraine in the coming months, if not weeks. The training of pilots and technical personnel has been ongoing for about 6 months in various countries. It is known that at least 70 people have gone to master Western aviation. Some pilots have already completed simulator training and are finishing the practical part of their preparation. This might be related to the Dutch Prime Minister's statement and regarding the transfer of F-16s.
It might be that 1 or 2 planes, or perhaps even more, have been transferred to those training centers where Ukrainian pilots are being trained, and that is the Skritstrup base in Denmark, where they are training, well, a small number of our pilots. Perhaps they are already flying the planes that will eventually be transferred to us.
Moreover, the announced start of the transfer might also be related to the fact that the planes are simply being prepared for specific tasks and working conditions in Ukraine.
The command of our air forces, well, the engineering command, surely requested some upgrades to the planes, to install more modern equipment and armaments. All of this will be coordinated, and this, as they say, is the beginning of the transfer process.
So why are the Russians so afraid that the F-16s will finally arrive in Ukraine? They indeed have plenty of reasons for this. Perhaps the main one is that their limited advances will most likely come to an end. After all, Russia's current tactic is total air support for the troops. By daily bombing the positions of the Ukrainian armed forces and frontline territories with aerial bombs, the pilots of Aviation were not at risk until recently. Since the end of last year, they have started being shot down, evidently by Western air defense systems, and soon the F-16s will join them.
They have a wide range of armaments with dozens and dozens of types. Aviation missiles can strike, meaning they can drive away Russian aviation. They will know that a pair of F-16s is taking off here, and they simply won't approach. They just won't be there. The Patriot system has worked successfully a couple of times, and for some reason, they don't appear there. The same effect will be with the F-16s.
At the same time, engaging in an air battle with these planes would be suicidal for Russian pilots. After all, the F-16 is more maneuverable and has longer range weapons, which practically nullifies the possibility of a counterattack from enemy fighters.
This is what we need to gain air superiority over the occupied territories. When the Russian aviation withdraws, the ground troops will have no air cover, and it will be significantly easier, very significantly easier, for our defense forces to advance and liberate our territories. This is the key to success.
Moreover, the F-16s can be useful to the air forces, not only for carrying out tasks on the front line. There is plenty of work for them over the Black Sea waters, and even deep within Ukrainian territory.
The F-16 is multi-role, therefore multifunctional. It performs functions of striking air, ground, and surface targets. Plus, it can be part of the air defense system within the country, destroying drones and missiles as efficiently as possible.
Accordingly, the objectives set for the pilots are also very diverse and varied. According to analysts, a sufficient number of F-16 fighters could even turn the tide of the war. After all, one of the main challenges of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023 was precisely the lack of support from our aviation and the enemy's air superiority. And acquiring Western aircraft can break this hegemony.
It's necessary to disrupt the enemy's logistics, meaning supply routes, bridges, crossings, ammunition depots, and fuel and lubricants. And then the offensive operation is destined for success.
There is also much debate about where the F-16s transferred to Ukraine will be based. There were even suggestions that the permanent base would be in Poland and that pilots would fly missions from there. However, with a maximum flight range of over 4,000 kilometers, the declared combat radius is still 550 kilometers. So most likely the aircraft will be located up in Ukraine, which was indirectly confirmed by the Air Force.
If they are dispersed across different operational airfields, as is currently the case with Soviet equipment, then they can quickly take off, destroy, and land.
The issue of Ukrainian airfields not meeting the demanding standards of the Western F-16, which was often mentioned, seems to no longer be a concern. According to the Air Force, these aircraft have already been to Ukraine multiple times. In 2012, they ensured the security of the Euro 2012 football championship, and in 2018 they flew to Starokostiantiniv. All takeoffs and landings were successful at that time. They also managed to convince partners that the F-16s can be kept safe, even in war-torn Ukraine. For example, the airfield in Starokostiantiniv has endured multiple missile attacks since the start of the full-scale invasion, including the notorious Kinjal missiles, yet it still operates successfully, and there have been no reports of aircraft being destroyed there. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes of Arsenal.